Thank you, Jesse. That was wonderful. I really didn't give him anything to go on. We did have a discussion about buttons on jackets, didn't we? And as you've heard, it makes you look like a fat man if you don't do the top button. Well, I'm not doing the top button because I would have to breathe in for the next 45 minutes and there would be no talk. So I'm not going to do that. Incidentally, this gentleman here looking out over the hall is my great-great-grandfather, Francis Collison. And we've met lots of remarkable people from history today in various talks. I like to think that this is a remarkable man from history. I am, of course, very biased. Hopefully, through my train of thought, you'll begin to agree. Or I think you might find your own kind of special folks from history closer to home for you afterwards. Today, we have looked at a lot of things that really matter to me, and I think they'll be reflected in this talk. That's no coincidence. The 7 of us who've spoken today have kind of been in touch, and we share topics, we share ideas. And I always think it's a really good thing at an event such as Build that we see these shared and familiar themes coming through the day. It enforces ideas, it helps us agree that we're on the right path. And, you know, we're looking back further to folks who came up with wonderful solutions and ideas decades ago, centuries ago. And we're now beginning to learn from those. So I think that's a good thing. So to end today's talks, I want to try and continue the surge of optimism as I see it. We've had some warnings today, specifically in the last talk from Jeremy. We need to be mindful of a lot, but there's a lot to be positive about. And each of us has a role in that. So this talk will extend a little on the article I wrote for the first edition of the manual, which I'm sure you all own. If not, I don't really know what to say about that, Andy. This is the bit where we said for the video we would put a URL just here. Sorry, there. There we go. So that's the manual. But to begin with, I want to tell you a little about my ancestors. My greatest work. Also, I've rehearsed that, if nothing else, for at least a month, and getting those keynote transitions right almost always failed. So there you go. I have no future in TV. So, when I think about my ancestors, I think about bricks. Let me explain. I'm going to talk about the Collison heritage, if you like, firstly. I'm not going to talk about my mother's side of the family, the Chamberlains. I'd like to. They were a bunch of rogues, losers, drinkers, and champion badger baiters. But unfortunately, as try as I might, I really couldn't find many parallels for this talk. The kind of things we get up to after the conference is finished, yes, but not for the talk itself. So, I'm going to focus on the Collisons, shortly, briefly. I'm going to start with John Collison, that is the correct spelling, and he was born in 1450. I know this because I have a slightly mad cousin who I really don't associate with very much. But she has traced our family history somehow, with some accuracy, back to 1450. And we begin with John Collison, and he was a brickmaker in Suffolk, in England. He's actually my great-granddad 13 times over. which is kind of a weird thing to actually know that much about somebody from your history. Unless your name's Windsor, perhaps, in which case you'd look back and they wouldn't be called Windsor. But that's another story. We move forward 300 years. It's amazing what you can find on the internet. William Collison. The progression in trade is pretty logical. There were some blacksmiths and there were some farmers, but for the most part, my family have made things with bricks, or created bricks. His son, John Collison, he was a bricklayer. William, Henry, George, Robert, Samuel, and the wonderfully named Ambrose were all bricklayers. You've already met Francis, my great-great-grandfather. Just look at those hands. He was a bricklayer. And he had a number of sons, Luke, Albert, Clive, and Samuel. And when they left school, most of them went into the army. Then what do you think they did? Bricklayers. They went where the work was. And around 1850, like many provincial cities in the UK, Nottingham was building upon itself to the point where it was becoming an unworkable city. There were slums in the centre of Nottingham that were just unfit for any human being to live in. So it was finally decided that the land around the city would be enclosed, and on it would be built thousands of terraced houses. So Francis and his sons plied a very, very fruitful trade in Nottingham. Wonderfully, they were able to name certain streets that they built after some of the villages that they'd moved from. They even created Collison Street. This would be an immense sense of pride for me. Were Collison Street not now a shithole? But saying that, it gives me one hell of a dream to aspire to when I eventually have enough money. The way I'm going, that won't happen for a long time. But I will eventually buy that street and turn it into the best street in Nottingham. And you'll all be invited to live there, and it'll be like Pigeon Street. And it will be wonderful. Francis had a son, one of the four, called Samuel, and he's my great-grandfather. And he was a bricklayer. And some of his sons went into those kinds of trades. Obviously, things were starting to change. But with my grandfather and my dad, most of the photos of my dad, by the way, he's horizontal. It's a whole other lecture. That basically, the idea of building ceased. There was blue-collar work, there was war, of course, there was unemployment. But nothing as meaningful as building with bricks. Still, discovering this whole lineage for my family really fascinated me. Just going back to what Jeremy was talking about how we archive and save things for the future. I didn't know about much of this, and neither did my crazy cousin, until after my grandfather's death. And the photographs you've just seen, some of the, Francis and so on, we found those on top of a wardrobe. We didn't know about them until we cleared the house. And it was a wonderful discovery to actually put faces to those names. Thinking about this lineage forced me to draw certain conclusions about what I do, what they did with bricks, and what I do as a designer with pixels, whatever tools I use. I think I started to understand a little bit more about my principles and why I'm fascinated with order and structure, building things, and hopefully trying to make things better. When I think about bricks, I'm always conscious of the craftsman. When I think about my family, I've become conscious of them as craftsmen. And the craftsman's consciousness of materials appears in this long history of brick building. It's a history that stretches way back to ancient Mesopotamia. What it shows us through history is the way that anonymous workers leave traces of themselves in inanimate things. So with this in mind, I'd like to explore how we as individual builders of the web leave our own trace on the web. I want to start with the destination, which is a slightly misleading title because I sort of don't believe in the destination. We heard earlier from the Standardistas this idea of setting goals. And I've spoken to Chris in the last few hours, and there are areas where we agree and disagree on this. I think for a younger practitioner, an ambitious postgraduate or whatever, I think it can be really, really important. What's interesting for us on the web is that setting goals can be quite, not dangerous perhaps, but maybe a mistake, maybe misleading. In that the area we work in moves so fast, it is in very many ways transient. We can set certain goals, but maybe they should be more short-term. I'm very fortunate that from time to time, people are foolish enough to ask me to do interviews about the work I do. And I mostly enjoy this. Anyone who's had a similar experience, or even perhaps your average job interview, will be familiar with that question. And again, it was something that was referenced at the start of the day. What do you think you'll be doing in 5 years? I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing next week. So I can't answer this question. I'm not sure how many of you could answer that question. In terms of your learning curve and how fast the things are moving for you and the kind of, the chances you take and the fact that you're at Build today, you'll meet people today perhaps that might change your path, excite you about other things that you didn't list on a list of goals when you set about being a web designer. I've come up with a fairly stock answer now to these kind of things. I try not to set goals. When I was a younger man, or when I was in a less fortunate position of work, perhaps I was employed at an agency that I didn't feel comfortable in, sure, I set goals. I plotted escape mechanisms. I wanted to move away from perhaps the limitations of what I was doing. But now with a little bit of hindsight and a few miles under my belt and a few pounds under the belt, I don't worry anymore. I try not to worry. In some ways I'm fortunate because I've kind of worked to get to that place. But that's the kind of goal I like. A goal that actually gets you to a place where goals sort of become meaningless. And what we do becomes more about what we do, the doing, actually making and doing. I was also asked to present this at an unnamed conference last year. Well, it had a name, but I'm not going to name it. What will the web look like in 2 years' time? This was the single hardest task I think I've ever been given. A, I was kind of disappointed that I was given a topic to talk about. But B, how do I do that? It's like predicting football scores. Who saw the advent of the iPad and the iPhone? Or at least the effect they have had on the kind of work we do? If you did, have a biscuit. You're very rare. I think that shit's fucked up and bullshit. I'm perhaps not as angry about that as you might think, but I really wanted to use that slide. If there's one thing I've learned out of the whole Occupy movement, at least that came out of it, which is wonderful. We can make calculated guesses, perhaps. Of course we can. Every event we come to, we look at the future, we consider the future, and we're absolutely right to. But making goals around that? Not sure. But the inherent impossibility of these kind of questions fascinates me. All I can do standing here today on this kind of topic is look at what I think we do know. And that's us as individuals, how each one of us can have an impact. In many ways, today's talk is a call to action, a call to arms. I'm treading some old ground here. Some of these things will be very familiar to you. Some of it might seem like careers advice. But I mean this stuff from the bottom of my heart because I care about where the web goes. And I genuinely believe that each of us has a role to play in that. It's not a place for passengers. Each of us has a role to play, a brick to lay. So let's get back to this idea of doing, the doing. It's the kind of thing you have to say when you're sober. If you talk about this when you're pissed, it goes very wrong. The importance of doing. This is what really fascinates me at the moment. I'm not looking necessarily myself for some kind of utopian web. I can't imagine what that would be. If you asked me in 2006, I would have had no idea what I'd be doing now. And I love that. I absolutely love that. I'm more interested in thinking and making. I like to consider what the act of making reveals about me, and obviously what it reveals about you. I sometimes look at the work I'm doing. I sort of periodically audit what I'm doing almost. And I think, am I in my work? And I would hope that you would do the same and consider, are you in your work? After all, design is a very unique thing, and we're very fortunate to be working in the field of design. It's really a place of question and answer, of here is a problem, here is a solution. It's a place where personality can run riot. And each of you has a personality, and each of you should invest that in your work. We hear a lot of talk about storytelling on the web, and I think that's an extremely important subject. And I'm trying to learn more about telling stories in the work I do. But let's not forget that each of us is a story. I think that's something the really smart ones amongst us understand. American stand-up comedian and actor Patton Oswalt refers to this as the going. He's American, so he would have a slightly different word. It took me until my 40s to realize it. There's no destination. There's no getting anywhere. There's just the going. The key to life is to make the going really fun. Because people are like, if I just get to this, then boom. And then they get there, and there's this dawning of an afterwards. Patton goes on, I can not do anything for weeks or months if I need to, and just sit and read books or watch movies. I'm just as fine consuming and absorbing new art as I am trying to make it. It's all in the going. I couldn't agree more. And it's a belief totally at odds with this established notion of setting goals, which can invariably end in disappointment. Professor and author Dan Gilbert continues this theme. He says, the reason that most of us are unhappy most of the time is that we set our goals not for the person we're going to be when we reach them. We set our goals for the person we are when we set them. And that's kind of rubbish for the web, really. I've learned to agree with these two very wise men. Sometimes nowadays I like to stop and look around me, let the ivy grow over me a little, reevaluate, consume and consider. I think that feeds the kind of work I do, and I think we can all benefit from looking around us a little more. I was reminded of a breakfast conversation I had a few months ago. Frank, who's here today, was one of the folks at the table. And he eloquently summed up our discussion, basically. We mostly talked about not necessarily slowing down, but rather just opting out of speed. And this has stayed with me. Now, I interpret it a slightly different way. I had my own thoughts about that conversation, and I carry it with me this way. I'm opting out of chasing specific long-term goals, or even trying to define them at all. Instead, I'm happy to focus on what I'm doing now. I want to see what happens. There's a word we've heard several times already today, and I make no excuse for including it again. Serendipity. Serendipity's been very kind to me. I've taken chances, but still, I've encouraged serendipity. By simply doing, we open up to this, and the positive changes that we could never foresee if we set goals and went hell for leather just for those goals. My golden rule is never to get too comfortable. That makes it easier for me to embrace the unique ebb and flow of the web and be truly responsive as an individual. What's more, if we're comfortable doing and we understand our own strengths and values, we'll inevitably make easier, better, and perhaps braver decisions. This brings me to strengths and values. I stand by what I wrote in the manual. To progress and to create great work of substance, we have to know our own values, our strengths, and the level of expertise we seek. Understanding this helps us make those strong decisions. It navigates us through the glut of information and the tsunami of stuff that's coming at us from all sides on the web. I think the great practitioners, whatever their field, and the people we've looked at today and have been reflected in presentations, have found a way to continue to learn, but focus specifically on what they love or what they're truly caring about. They lean on their strengths and they react to their values. Sometimes what others perceive as weaknesses can be spun into personal strengths. Thomas Edison here, clever man. I love him for this quote. "I have not failed 700 times. I have not failed once. I have succeeded in proving that those 700 ways will not work. When I have eliminated the ways that will not work, I will find the way that will work." Weaknesses are not defined by failure. As Edison shows us, failure is an essential component of success. No, weaknesses are quite simply the things we're not good at. That's what weaknesses are. Things that we must choose to either get better at or simply accept as weaknesses and just move on. Seriously, accept that you'll never be good at some things and never give them another second's thought. By contrast, I think our strengths usually find us. We often realise we're good at something by accident or when we least expect it. Many people in this room will have become web designers by accident, perhaps. It probably wasn't the long-term goal when you were at school. But then I say that as a 38-year-old who's lost all track of time and is still amazed when people were born in the 90s. It blows my mind. I don't mean babies and children, you know what I mean. People who I meet on a level playing field. Anyway, that's just an aside. Forget that. But it turned out that fiddling with some HTML and, depending on your timeline, some CSS and putting bits and pieces together, it's kind of like Lego. Discovered we were good at it. We stuck at it. It became a strength. It became a skill. But the wise ones, I think, know that we can't master every aspect of our trade. We have to push harder in some areas and inevitably be a bit weaker in others. On the web, I don't think this is in any way a bad thing, but it is something we have to come to terms with as individuals. I think in some senses, it's a bit like the tea earlier. We become greater than the sum of our parts. I really like this suggestion that on the web we are 80%ers. By being 80% at the many things we need to know to make brilliant online experiences, we get close to 100% in the trade of web design itself. Quite simply, we need a broad familiarity across many disciplines and a deep knowledge in one. That's me, and I assume for the most part that's you. We must each identify our strengths and weaknesses, discover or rediscover our values, let these inform our work, and let these be in our work. And in turn, our work can inform us. For some of us, it might look a little bit more like this. This is an approximation of me, but it's project by project. All I can try and do is be 100% web designer. So this brings me on to the idea of how we learn, which again we've heard a little about today. We are, of course, always learning from real-life situations, professional experiences, accidents, traditional devices like the book, web pages, workshops, people like me stood on a stage. But none of us are truly experts. The lessons we learn come not just from professionals, teachers, or from others within our industry, but from perhaps unexpected and disguised sources. On the web, many of us are pretty much self-taught. And even if you went and did a course somewhere, I'm not talking about Dreamweaver BTEC level 2 or whatever, but actually went and did a course, perhaps something like they do at the University of Ulster with the Standard Easters, that's a period of time. And time moves on, and our industry moves on. And we have to be continually learning, and we know this. We're learning forever. We combine creativity with pragmatism. John Tan said, "I'm self-actualized, without the stamp of approval from any guild, curriculum, authority, or academic institution. I'm web-taught, colleague-taught, empirically taught." In the manual, I mentioned Linda Holmes's wonderful article, "The Sad, Beautiful Fact That We're Going to Miss Almost Everything." Sad and beautiful, remember. I think it's a beautiful, uplifting thing. In that article, Linda looks at how we manage the weight of information coming our way and the possibilities available to us. This obviously works for the web, but also popular culture. You're not going to see every movie. You're not going to be able to listen to every band. You're not going to be able to go to every conference. She discusses ideas of cull and surrender, and I would advise you to read the manual, or more specifically Linda's article, if you want to use those tools to help you manage the weight of information coming your way. Much like our weaknesses that we must either try to improve or simply accept that they're weaknesses and move away from, there are subjects we'd like to learn more about, but can't or won't. I've said it before, but if I think about the scale of the universe, or kind of anything about the universe, it absolutely breaks my head in half, and my brain just melts out my ears. I am no Brian Cox. I have no concept of it all, except that for me, it is made of magic. That is what the universe is. That's all I need for now. I love a quote from Douglas Adams, who recalls a theory which states that if ever anybody discovers exactly what the universe is for and why it's here, it will instantly disappear and be replaced by something even more bizarre and inexplicable. He goes on to say that there's another theory which states that this has already happened. Whoa. I need that GIF now, the mind explosion GIF. But seriously, you're either interested in that or you're not. You have time for that or you don't. We can translate that to the things we need to learn for the web. We can translate that to programming languages, to methodologies, to all the various opinions out there that are being thrown at us day by day. Earlier, it was mentioned, Cameron Kozon, his idea of orbital content, where instead of us feeling tied to web services and networks we use that hold our data, we should aim for a model where our data is entirely portable, where that data revolves around us, where we can pull our data out of one service if it gets sold or pisses us off, and take it to another, or build our own. Thus, our content orbits around us, not us orbiting around perhaps walled content. So thinking about this, it makes me think kind of philosophically about how we learn. And I like the idea of our our learning revolving around us. I'm not trying to stick a flag in the sand with that term, by the way. It's just for reference. I think to do this, we can start to curate the way we learn, control what we learn, dictate what we learn, when and where from. Choose not to be dictated about what you must learn, but instead you call the shots. You define your own course of learning. Aside from leveraging a few technical possibilities and writing a plan of action, there probably aren't any real tools for this. It's more of a philosophy. It's a state of mind. Saying to yourself, I'm in control of what I'm learning. I make the choices. I think it's okay to go off curriculum. If we all end up feeling like we have to learn the very same things in this industry, we end up the same. We lose the excitement, and I'm not in favour of that. I think we need to curate our focus. What good is all the latent information we've got stored up? Piles of books, months and months of Instapapered articles, notes we never acted upon. It becomes a pile, an outdated pile. It's a weight we can do without. It's broad and non-specific to our focus. Obviously, our industry is growing so quickly and splintering into so many fragments, we increasingly find a need to specialise and reduce the number of areas where we might be considered an expert or even competent. Knowing our strengths and values helps us understand where we should focus. To attempt mastery of everything inevitably makes us mediocre in some areas. I'm not interested in being a mediocre Rails programmer, a mediocre PHP programmer. It just doesn't interest me. I don't seek to have a mediocre understanding of anything. Inevitably, I will. Back to this idea of us being 80%ers. As a designer often working in collaborative situations, I need a little knowledge of what the other team members can contribute and what their limits are. But in most cases, that's all I need, a basic understanding. I might want more, but what I need is enough. I focus on my strengths, mastering my core skills. And I study other fields and subjects that will enrich and deepen my work and give me insight around my particular interests. This defines my path as a designer and fulfills my desire to develop my craft in a meaningful way. If ever you feel the weight of learning is too much, and there's just too much to cope with being a web designer, especially those of us that ploughed the trenches around the browser wars and IE 5 and 6 and all those things and losing hours on this stuff, just remember how many other things in life have become so much easier. What that magic little device in your pocket now lets you do that you couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Things are kind of getting better. Also, you don't need to know everything that's on the internet. You don't need to have read every single design book or programming book. I haven't. I'm really, really dim in certain subjects. I'm either lucky or, more likely, I know where to find the information I need. And I can ask somebody who has a specialism in something that I don't have. So this brings me to the idea of our craft. We've heard about craftsmanship a little today. Let me go again back to bricks. There's a wealth of possibility with brick. Detail. The ability to imbue brickwork with craft approaches, manufacture, treatments, chemical interventions, combinations. I'm actually going to quote a brick historian, which I think might be the first for a web conference. So I will have at least achieved something today. Mr. Alec Clifton Taylor suggests that what most counts about bricks is their size, which just suits the human hand laying a brick. A brick wall is an aggregation of small effects. This implies a human and intimate quality. Brickwork imposes a restraint. In Great Britain and Ireland, it took us centuries to make up the ground that the ancient Romans had done for us, like in many cases in the world. Only in the 1400s did something approaching the technological sophistication of Roman brick building appear. But even then, brick making was an ordinary skill of country life, just like my 13 times granddad was doing. With the advent of cottage kilns, bricks became varied based on clays and techniques. And here, the human personality was being invested in them. In the 18th century, builders could make use of a variety of brick types and application methods to not just represent social status in buildings, but also give craftsmen more freedom to experiment in their work. Brick meant authenticity, and this term, honest brick, came to being. Honest brick essentially countered the fakery that we were starting to see then in mass-produced brick. Good builders would select only the best bricks from the canal barges, bricks that reflected or embodied their own values. The craftsman creating something simple and honest is as thoughtful as a craftsman contriving an amazing fantasy. This reminds us that the hand of the craftsman is a sign of superior quality, or the human individual. We enjoy handmade goods, an awareness of the craftsman and the imperfections of unique products. Richard Sennett, who we met earlier this morning, in his book proposes that craftsmanship is a basic human impulse, the desire to do a job well for its own sake. Sennett sees this as a core value, And I think it's a value open to everybody working on the web. So we ask ourselves, do we simply want to make a living and move from project to project, just getting the job done? Or do we want to imbue our every process with the skill, integrity, and value of a true craftsman? I wanted to say this earlier, by the way, and it's a little caveat, but when I say craftsman, I mean craftsperson, I mean craftswoman. I want you to know that. But then I thought every time I come across that and have to say that, I'm going to bog myself down a bit. So if you've already tweeted about that, just delete it. Thanks. I am a good guy, I promise. So when it comes to craftsmanship on the web, think of the careful and meticulous pushing of pixels, the process of hand coding, the idiosyncrasies and courageous, instinctive designer. I often consider how automation is robbing us of the knowledge that craftsmanship requires. If I want, I can go to one of my bookmarks or find on the web an automator for almost any CSS3 process. Rounded corners, rotations, gradients, you name it. And I can get some dirty copy and paste code, fine. But by doing so, I initially at least failed to understand from the ground up exactly what is happening in that process and how I can apply craftsmanship to manipulate and create something more thoughtful, nuanced, or even extraordinary. I'm proud that I learned CSS myself in a text editor, not WYSIWYG, and I battled every step to make it do what I wanted it to do. I did the hours. Craftspeople do the hours. I battled year after year. I'd have hated to have been robbed of that experience, that raw beginning. I wouldn't feel like a craftsman. I sometimes wonder, to take this metaphor forwards, if we can imagine our desk or our office as a more traditional workshop, a place where we remember and exploit the satisfaction of making and doing. We discover through doing, honing our skills over a significant period of time with substantial commitment. We understand the importance of mistakes. Craftspeople are often prepared to throw away perhaps 70% of what they produce. Certainly artists and so on would definitely say that. But the magical 30% is worth it. But those craftspeople would also say that the whole 100% was worth it. Our hope is that with craftsmanship at the heart of what we do, our peers, our clients, our audiences will appreciate good craftsmanship amidst this vast sea of cowboy work and rip-offs. Craftsmanship makes our work more meaningful to us. It also spreads the perception that our industry is valuable, irreplaceable, vital. That alone is reason enough to continue investing every ounce of blood, sweat, and tears in every website or app that we build. I think of it like this way. Every time we set about creating a website, we should challenge ourselves to make it the best website we've ever made. To the idea of tools. We've heard some wonderful stuff about tools today, especially from Wilson. One of the biggest mistakes, I think, and this is a very personal view, and I'm happy to be called out on it, but I'm very happy to think that we lean on our tools too much on the web. We make our work about these tools, but what we do is not about tools, whether programming languages, methodologies, software, browsers, or mobile devices. To a certain extent, tools are the scaffold for what we produce. They are enablers. They help us bring our ideas to fruition. But robbed of our favourite tools, we'd still, I hope, manage to achieve that wonder of communication in design. Should we limit ourselves by worrying if a content management system can do X or Y or Z? Absolutely not. Besides, I love this idea that the equipped and organised web designer is the best CMS in the world. It goes without saying that craftsmen use and need their tools, and that in most cases the right tools enhance the quality of the end product. We find a poetic beauty in the idea of a craftsman and his tools. Some tools become beautiful in their own right, as antique objects or artefacts. If you've ever been lucky enough to hold a Stone Age tool, in your hands, a raw, primal piece of flint perhaps, as I did a few years ago. A tool shaped to perform tasks of the day. You'll appreciate that despite thousands and thousands of years of technological evolution, there's a stunning sensation you feel as you hold a tool like that and enter the mind of an ancestor putting it to use. Time moves on, but our hands are the same. The tools still fit. I think your best tools are your brain, your experience, your instinct, your courage. Indeed, a lot of people talk about this idea of design thinking. It's a little pretentious perhaps, but I quite like it because for the most part, that's what we do. A lot of thinking. We're paid to think. We do our best work after thinking. We do it day in, day out across a wide array of ideas and problems and responses. We think and then we do. If we're thinking our way around our work and the needs of our users, we should not feel bound by our tools. Design is a broader and more magical thing than that. We should at least initially try to think about the purpose of design outside of apps and languages and methodologies. Tools are enablers, but what we do isn't about them. If what we did every day was about tools, we'd simply work our lives out in some kind of crazy Mobius strip of endless tooling. The end product of a website would just be a byproduct. I'm trying to get away from the idea of apps, languages, and methodologies defining what I do. Try to think of my bag as a mobile workshop. It's a simple premise, but it works for me. I don't feel bound by all the tools. I don't feel bound by how I will bring ideas to fruition. I've got a dirty old sketchbook in there that I can tear up and rip things out of. I've got a few pens. And yes, I've got my laptop, but I need my laptop, obviously. Caveat. The most important tool for me, wherever I go, is my brain. I do think tools are, for the most part, secondary. As Oliver Reichenstein said, the tool doesn't make the craftsman. Choosing the right tool for the right purpose is a technical and personal choice. Designers enhance communication, whether to the largest possible audience or a specific audience. We seek emotive responses and actions. To reduce the impact of communication because we feel bound by our tools, or conversely, to throw in 1,000 clever CSS3 tricks because we can, is to lose sight of our responsibility as designers. We all need courage to do what we do. I don't think design follows logic. So all our responses will be different. So make your response reflect your own courage and instinct, and at least as far as you're able to take that influence, perhaps in a client scenario or whatever. It's a human instinct to want to investigate, to know why, and to create something significant or lasting. We learn, we grow, and we transcend the mundanity and limitations of our tools. I often consider what distinguishes the great from the good, or what makes some designers more equipped than others. And I believe they often inquire beyond the necessary, to explore other ideas, look at things differently, and bring these findings back into their work. Milton Glaser talks about how being given a puzzle is always better than being given an answer. And we can apply this to our process, our projects, and our craft. Truly creative people have an unswerving desire to inquire into their craft more deeply. Simply performing those core tasks admirably day by day is really satisfaction enough. We desire, or we should desire, to broaden influences, draw upon wider fields of knowledge, and make connections and discoveries out there, and find new outcomes in our own specific line of inquiry. To proceed without such inquiry is to be a drone, unlikely to advance yourself to anything meaningful. These individual lines of inquiry are, I think, what will, more than anything else, drive us to develop greater maturity in this discipline of web design. You think about sharing. It's why we're all here today. We come together to share our thoughts and ideas, to consolidate our thinking and concerns, and ultimately with a big hive-brain desire to ensure the web industry is stronger tomorrow. We all want the web to be stronger the next day, and the day after that. We defined web standards as a community who cared too much to take the money and run. We wanted order amidst the chaos. Off the back of that, we became an industry of mostly selfless practitioners, each determined to do their bit, to follow their own lines of inquiry, and then, magically, share. I was always happy to work on some tricky problem for 3 months or something, and as soon as I'd solved it, release it on my site. Because 10 other people would do the very same thing that night. We were building on each other's shoulders, growing richer and more mature day by day. So to conclude, the screen in the corner says game over, but thankfully I'm not dead. This brings me to an idea of the complete designer. I'll return one last time to bricks. With the Industrial Revolution, the mass-produced machined brick quashed some belief in the inherent virtue of the brick. Machines even replicated the handcrafted details of man-made bricks. Our forefathers faced the same issues we have faced in creating the link between creativity and technology, ensuring the two can stand side by side. So where's all of this brought us? It brings us closer to an almost Zen-like idea of a complete web designer. It's a designer who finds problems and designs responses, not answers, not solutions, just responses. It's a designer who appreciates the process, the doing, the making. One who measures his or her contribution not against goals, but against personal values. One with integrity, who thinks carefully, has strong instincts, is courageous. One not bound by tools or methodologies. A craftsman or craftswoman with a desire to investigate, to inquire, and to share. We should each learn the things we think we need to learn, then grow smart enough to forget them, so that everything we do becomes an instinct. The future belongs to the few of us still willing to get our hands dirty. The ones who delve deeper, try stuff, lose the shackles, fail, learn, every step of the way. Everyone in this room surely wants to create meaningful work with a long shelf life and ensure it can flex and grow. We must do our work and we must do it well. Above all, we have to care, and I mean really care, about what we do. Being a designer and building the web isn't a job. It's a craft, a motivation, a need to make things better. And if that doesn't sound right to any of you, you shouldn't be building the web. We are the builders, we are the makers, we are the users, we are the explorers. We're each of us bricklayers, and brick by brick, we will leave our trace. For ourselves as individuals, and for the broader industry, we should make every single brick count. Thank you.